Hola, muy buenas. Bienvenidos al programa Energía al Máximo.
Vivimos entre el petróleo, pero nos predicen su pico de demanda. ¿Qué papel seguirá jugando el petróleo en el consumo energético mundial? Ante la incertidumbre de la demanda, ¿invertir o no invertir en los campos de petróleo para asegurar el suministro? ¿Qué recomendaciones se dan y qué planes tienen algunas de las principales petroleras del mundo? El precio del crudo en la tormenta de factores geopolíticos, económicos y de mercado. ¿Cuánto nos va a costar el petróleo a medio plazo? Analizamos los impactos en el precio de petróleo con el experto de la agencia internacional ICIS.
Hay un producto con el que nos encontramos todos los días. Cuando bebéis agua de la botella de plástico, cuando usáis envases en la comida, cuando lleváis alguna ropa de tejido sintético y cuando sus hijos juegan con los juguetes. Sin pensar en el origen de los objetos, en la vida cotidiana nos encontramos con bienes cuya producción está, de una o de otra forma, muy relacionada con este producto y sus derivados, el petróleo. Estoy segura que lo primero en lo que pensamos cuando oímos esta palabra es en la gasolina, en el precio de combustible. Y por supuesto es algo que preocupa a todos nosotros. ¿Cuánto nos va a costar coger gasolina para el coche? Y es verdad que el petróleo se utiliza para la producción de gasolina, diésel, queroseno de aviación. Los usos de petróleo no tienen que ver solo con sus propiedades como combustible, sino que nosotros vivimos entre el petróleo. Los lubricantes y anticongelantes que se utilizan para mantener el motor en buenas condiciones se derivan de él. Los plásticos son probablemente los productos petroquímicos más representativos. La petroquímica es la rama de la industria que utiliza productos derivados del petróleo como materia prima para la producción de una amplia gama de productos, plásticos, cauchos, fertilizantes, pinturas, etc. El hombre ha aprendido a utilizar casi todo lo relacionado con el proceso de refino de petróleo. Incluso el concentrado que se queda tras la destilación del petróleo se utiliza en fabricación de revestimientos para carteras y obras de construcción. Incluso los medicamentos elaborados a partir de componentes del petróleo también han recibido un reconocimiento por parte de la medicina oficial. El medicamento más famoso elaborado a partir de petróleo es la aspirina. Y la lista de estos productos es enorme. Nos demuestra la importancia del petróleo en nuestras vidas. El petróleo también se llama el oro negro, porque su participación en el consumo energético mundial está en torno al 30%. El petróleo es una parte importante de la historia de muchos países. El descubrimiento de campos de petróleo ha contribuido al desarrollo de nuevos territorios y al desarrollo económico. Por lo tanto, la importancia del petróleo para la economía ha dado lugar a muchos conflictos geopolíticos. La capacidad de controlar campos petroleros o rutas de transporte de petróleo puede ser objeto de disputas o conflictos. Por lo tanto, cuando los precios de petróleo cambian, pueden afectar a todos los sectores de economía. Y en este entorno energético cambiante, marcado por la transición energética, marcado por el crecimiento económico, marcado por la demanda, por la geopolítica, queremos ver qué es lo que nos espera en términos del papel de petróleo en nuestro consumo y también las tendencias de precios. Bueno, al mismo tiempo continúa el debate sobre el futuro del petróleo. La Agencia Internacional de la Energía, por ejemplo, y la Organización de Países Exportadores de Petróleo, la OPEP, se han enfrentado en los últimos años sobre cuestiones como la futura demanda de petróleo. ¿Qué es lo que nos espera realmente? ¿Cómo vamos a consumir? Las previsiones de la OPEP y de la IE son las más importantes para los inversores. Aquí veis detrás de mí el gráfico justo de la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Y en los últimos meses, esta agencia ha revisado varias veces al alza su escenario sobre la demanda de petróleo para este año, para el 2024. Y su proyección sigue siendo inferior a las expectativas de la OPEP. Y dice que el consumo global aumentará en 1,2 millones de barriles por día en 2024. Pero también la agencia dice que a partir del 2026, y veis un poco esta gráfica que va reduciéndose a partir del 2026, la demanda de petróleo como combustible para el transporte va a bajar. ¿Lo veis? Estos picos de amarillo que están abajo. El crecimiento restante de la demanda provendrá principalmente de los petroquímicos y los combustibles de aviación. Según las políticas existentes, el crecimiento de la demanda mundial de petróleo se reducirá durante el periodo de pronóstico entre 2022 y el 2028 a medida que avanza la transición energética. Y a partir de principios de la década del 2030, la demanda de petróleo se va a estabilizarse o incluso va a empezar a reducirse lentamente. La agencia nos advierte que si los países del mundo continúan aumentando sus compras de petróleo y productos derivados del petróleo, entonces finalmente pueden poner fin a la implementación de planes para alcanzar los objetivos climáticos, incluida la neutralidad de carbono. Pero en la siguiente gráfica, esa es la gráfica de la Organización de Exportadores de Petróleo, la OPEP, sigue siendo optimista respecto al papel de petróleo en el futuro y mantiene su pronóstico de un crecimiento relativamente fuerte de la demanda. Aquí la gráfica es un poco diferente porque nos está indicando por las regiones, ahí era por sectores en la de Agencia Internacional, y esto es por regiones, qué regiones van a ser líderes en el consumo. Y el pronóstico para el 2025 está en línea con la opinión de esta Organización de Países Exportadores y dice que el uso de petróleo seguirá aumentando durante las próximas 2 décadas. La creciente demanda de energía en los mercados emergentes compensará, por ejemplo, China, India, esta creciente demanda va a compensar con creces la caída de la demanda en las economías desarrolladas. La OPEP espera que la demanda mundial de energía va a crecer más o menos en una tasa promedio de en torno a 1% hasta el 2045, mientras que la participación del petróleo se mantendrá prácticamente estable en alrededor del 30%. También vemos que la opinión de un pico de suministro de petróleo surgió hace muchas décadas. Seguramente que habéis oído hablar peak oil, pico de petróleo, y algunos predijeron que el petróleo se va a agotar. Y a lo largo de todo el tiempo, las repetidas predicciones sobre el pico de suministro de petróleo se han trasladado hacia el futuro y a niveles cada vez más altos. Y las predicciones pasadas sobre el pico de oferta se mantenían sobre diferentes suposiciones, sobre el tamaño de la base de recursos recuperables y una subestimación del impacto del avance tecnológico. Realmente hemos aprendido, se ha avanzado mucho la tecnología y hemos podido abarcar diferentes territorios mundialmente para explorar y producir nuevos campos petróleo y gas. Y hoy, por lo tanto, hoy en día se habla poco de un pico de oferta y la atención se desplaza hacia el pico de demanda de petróleo. En estos horizontes influyen políticas y teorías que han decidido que el petróleo no debería ser parte de un futuro energético sostenible. Como contraparte, hay un artículo muy interesante del secretario general de la OPEP de este año, justo de enero del año 2024, que se llama Una historia de picos no realizados. Y lo que dice es, lo que está claro es que el pico de demanda de petróleo no aparece en ningún pronóstico confiable y sólido a corto y medio plazo. Dadas estas tendencias de crecimiento, es un desafío alcanzar el pico de la demanda de petróleo para finales de la década. Apenas faltan 6 años. En última instancia, el pico de oferta de petróleo nunca se ha alcanzado y las predicciones sobre el pico de demanda de petróleo siguen una tendencia similar. Bueno, hemos visto estas diferencias en términos de la demanda, pero aparte de estos puntos, también la OPEP y la Agencia Internacional de Energía han chocado sobre la necesidad de invertir en un nuevo suministro de petróleo. Por supuesto, todos los inversores están mirando. ¿Y cuál será la demanda en el futuro? ¿Cuánto deberemos de invertir? ¿Qué campos debemos de explorar? Y la Agencia Internacional de Energía dice que el fin de la era de crecimiento de los combustibles fósiles socava la justificación para una mayor inversión. Vemos en la siguiente gráfica del informe del Foro Internacional de Energía, que han preparado una estimación que dice que la inversión anual en petróleo y gas debe aumentar hasta un 28% para alcanzar los 640.000 millones en el 2030. Sabemos cuáles han sido las inversiones de los años anteriores y en las dos rayas, las dos figuras al final, vemos cuánto hace falta invertir para garantizar un suministro global adecuado. La inversión anual en upstream, en exploración y producción, deberá aumentar de 500.000 millones de dólares en el 2022 a 640.000 millones de dólares en el 2030. Se necesitan 5 billones de dólares acumulados entre 2023 y 2030 para satisfacer las necesidades del mercado y evitar un déficit de suministro, incluso si el crecimiento de la demanda va a reducirse o estabilizarse. Esto es lo que dice otra agencia. Y al final es un círculo vicioso de volatilidad e inversión. Sigue siendo un clave en la próxima década. La alta volatilidad de los precios disuade la inversión y el retraso en la inversión potencialmente alimenta la volatilidad. Si la inversión no es suficiente, los altos precios y la alta volatilidad podrían convertirse en el nuevo estándar. Se necesita la misma inversión continua, si no a lo mejor más, para compensar la producción esperada y caídas para satisfacer el crecimiento de esta demanda del futuro. También grandes empresas, como por ejemplo ExxonMobil, comparten esta opinión y justo el año pasado han dicho que ExxonMobil apunta a una mayor producción de petróleo con un aumento de inversiones. La mayor compañía petrolera de Estados Unidos, por ventas, dijo que planifica un gasto de capital al año hasta 25.000 millones de dólares en el 2024, incluso aumentarlo hasta 27.000 millones de dólares en el 2027. Este aumento de desembolso de capital ayudará a la empresa a impulsar la producción de petróleo y gas en aproximadamente un 10% para el 2027. Y en la misma línea, Chevron, por ejemplo, otra empresa estadounidense importante, otro supermajor, dijo que espera invertir hasta 19,5 mil millones de dólares también en nuevos proyectos de petróleo y gas, y este aumento del 11% con respecto al año pasado. O sea, ambos supermajors estadounidenses contribuyeron al aumento de la producción nacional de Estados Unidos, que fue absolutamente récord el año pasado. Por lo tanto, vemos esta tendencia de invertir más, o en la necesidad de cubrir e invertir más en los campos de petróleo. Esta divergencia de pronósticos refleja una gran incertidumbre sobre las perspectivas de las principales economías. Hay temas clave que definirán una industria cambiante a medio plazo. Los cambios reflejan la interacción entre las fuerzas geopolíticas y económicas que sacuden al mundo hoy. Y la primera es, por supuesto, lo que hacen los miembros de la Organización de Países Exportadores de Petróleo. La segunda es la incertidumbre con la capacidad de producción de Estados Unidos de petróleo de esquisto para cubrir este déficit de oferta. Durante el primer auge del fracking, que duró aproximadamente entre 2010 y 2015, la producción de Estados Unidos aumentó, lo que provocó que el precio del petróleo cayera y debilitara la influencia de la OPEP. Pero las condiciones en la economía estadounidense han cambiado y interesaría ver si van a poder mantener esta producción. Y el tercer componente es la volatilidad del precio del petróleo, que tiene que ver con la demanda también. Y en esta tormenta de factores, de circunstancias, vamos a hablar con el experto hoy para entender qué es lo que nos espera en el medio plazo. Y vamos a hablar con el experto de ICIS, que es Independent Commodity Intelligence Service. La agencia crea una visión integral de los mercados y de diferentes productos de materias primas. Ofrece a diferentes empresas los datos y su inteligencia para tomar las decisiones. Algunos de vosotros nos habéis pedido hacer programas en inglés y consideramos que esto podría ser justo el asunto, el commodity internacional, el petróleo, para hacer esta entrevista en inglés, pero para su mayor comodidad vamos a habilitar los subtítulos, sobre todo que el idioma no sea una barrera. Well, now I will switch to English to give a warm welcome to our guest speaker from ICIS, Independent Commodity Intelligence Services, which is a part of the RELX group listed on London Stock Exchange. ICIS has a network of more than 350 experts providing forecast data and analysis covering over 140 commodity markets. And this service enables ICIS customers to make decisions, identify opportunities and mitigate risks in a vast range of rapidly evolving markets. And today with us we have the editor on global crude oil from ICIS, Barney Gray. Good afternoon, Barney.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Very nice to greet you in Negocios TV. Just a short introduction about you. So Barney leads a team which provides detailed analysis and insight into the global crude oil market and its wide range of drivers. The IC's crude team's flagship product is the World Crude Report, which publishes a huge range of oil price assessments and editorial content on North Sea, Asian and US crude markets. So Barney, we are very glad to make this deep dive with you into this oil market, so turbulent oil market. And my first question is, probably in oil markets, the demand is one of the key factors. And there are many differences in scenarios between International Energy Agency, for example, and OPEC countries and other agencies over the prospects on demand in mid-term. Next year, we should proceed from who will be right in terms of the growth in oil price dynamics. And if OPEC forecast turns out to be correct, prices will begin to rise. How does the oil demand mid-term outlook look like for ICES?
Yeah, very good question. Great place to start as well. There's quite a deal of disparity and difference between what OPEC are assuming is going to be the demand growth in 2024 and what the EIA and the IEA are both looking at in 2024 as well. I believe OPEC are looking for demand growth of about 2.25 million barrels a day this year. That's nearly twice the IEA's level of 1.2, and the US equivalent of these agencies is not much higher at 1.4 million. So OPEC, I do feel, is a more politicized organization. It's very much in their interests to look for higher numbers. Their 2025 number, if we're going to look that far out, again, is quite punchy, about 1.8, 1.9 million barrels a day growth, with the other agencies, well, in particular the EIA, who do put out a 2025 number, looking for a decrease down to 1.2. So I'm erring on the side of the more independent agency, the IEA, in thinking that it could be a bit disappointing this year. There's demand, there's limits on demand, certainly from growth in places like China and possibly even the US, which may not be as good as the previous year. So I'm looking on the lower side of the demand outlook for the midterm, certainly for the rest of this year.
And just in terms of who will be leading this demand growth, in the last 2 decades, the Asia-Pacific region has emerged as the leading area of global energy consumption. Globally, the region accounts for 57% of the crude oil trade. China, Middle East, and India will probably drive this oil consumption. What are your views on these countries? Who will be the leaders in consumption?
Well, yes, I think you're very correct to point to the Asia-Pacific region and also hopefully China, which is the largest consumer in that wider group. I mean, Asian demand, in total Asian demand is maybe 39, 40 million barrels a day. So it's very, very significant, and it's growing more crucially than the demand in places like the US and Europe. It's an area of growth and the expectation of future growth in demand. China of this is maybe 17 million barrels of demand, so the second largest consumer of oil in the world. If China doesn't grow or doesn't grow particularly quickly, you are really looking at quite stagnant, quite static growth in oil demand. And so it really is, the wider Asia is the engine of global growth, and China's the biggest part of that. So if we see another year similar to last year, although China did recover somewhat in terms of oil imports, it could be a bit of a break, a bit of an impediment on global demand growth, and you will be looking more at these lower end of the numbers that have been predicted that we spoke about earlier, rather than the OPEC numbers.
Well, it's true that China has been supporting the global crude demand for the past 20 years, and everybody's looking on China. But also one question is about India. India is expanding its refinery sector a lot. Do you think it also could be a bullish factor, increasing factor for oil prices, Indian case?
Yes, I mean, India's for such a huge population, its oil consumption isn't even a third of China's. Obviously, very different economy. It has got a significant refining industry. It's quite services based, so it remains to be seen how much India can grow from where it goes. It's got further industrialization to go, but it's going to be a leader in many respects in the services sector. So We don't kind of talk too much about India as being one of the growth engines of demand growth, but it's quite feasible over the slightly longer term, longer than the kind of horizons we're talking about here. I feel that India could easily add 1 or 2 million barrels, but maybe in the longer term, and to be a significant consumer. But at the moment, it's not a major player. We're not seeing the huge demand growth as yet. More a product supplier. So in terms of providing a wider range of products for the global market. So very important, but maybe second tier in terms of of the main players that we're looking at.
In terms of production, on another side, OPEC maneuvers. The countries of the OPEC Plus oil cartel at the end of November last year agreed on a voluntary reduction in oil production for the first quarter of this year, of 2024, in the amount of 2.2 million barrels a day. And investors are eyeing quarter one of this year's supply data to see whether OPEC Plus followed through on their plan. How has the market reacted to this decision?
Well, we thought there might be a little bit of a rally earlier in this year. We've only really seen 4 or 5 weeks of the current year, and oil prices have remained pretty much static despite the daily fluctuations we're seeing. We're seeing them kind of stuck around this $80 per barrel level. And really, one of the few bullish factors keeping the prices sustained here, I think, is the fact that OPEC are sustaining this 2.2 million barrel additional cut, certainly for the first 3 months of this year. I think possibly OPEC have got themselves in a little bit of a blind alley here, in the fact that I can't see this cut, this tranche of the cuts, being suddenly lifted in April, because what would we really do with an extra 2.2 million barrels a day on the global market? It would hurt prices. So I think they're going to have to meet around about the beginning of March, I believe is scheduled, and decide whether to carry on this cut and hope that the global economy recovers a little bit faster than is expected, or else they're going to have to kind of continue with this cut for certainly another quarter, which would possibly hurt OPEC revenues, because this current level of oil prices isn't ideal for them. So they're in a little bit of a position, and then I think we're going to have to wait for another month to see what they do.
Okay, Brazil, for example, is the largest oil producer in South America, almost 4 million barrels per day of crude. And Brazil received the invitation to join these OPEC countries in 2024, this year, but without taking part in output cuts. There is an opinion in the market that more the production is reduced in the world, and more it is concentrated among OPEC Plus producers. Do you share this view, and what could be the implications of this increased role of OPEC Plus?
Yes, I mean, I think what OPEC and their wider associations with the OPEC Plus group members is it's forming a political bloc, if you like, as you quite rightly say, adding Brazil, a major producer and a major growth producer as well, one of the main engines of let's call it non-OPEC growth at the moment. But yes, they haven't been in, well, then they're not going to take part in the cuts. So in terms of what is actually physically going to happen, probably not a lot. I think Brazil is possibly positioning itself for the future. And certainly aligning themselves with other major producers. It's best to be inside the club than outside the club is probably a way to look at it. But I can't see them participating in any cuts just now and for the remainder of the year and beyond, because I think OPEC Plus have been looking at South America. They've also potentially made overtures to Guyana to join as well, another major growth area. And at the moment, I think, it pays for these countries. They're very closely aligned with the US, but this is a political bloc, and they have, marketing power. They have political power as OPEC Plus represents. So in that terms, I think Brazil can't particularly lose in this case. And they may as well see what is available to them. They can always leave if it doesn't suit them.
And just you mentioned the United States, it's true that on the other hand, the United States producers benefited from repeated OPEC Plus cuts, which allowed them to stabilize prices. Domestic oil production was at a record level in 2023, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it reached more than 13 million barrels per day in the last quarter of last year. And it comes at a time when the US is trying to wean itself of fossil fuels, so going out of fossil fuels. But the US production is producing more than ever why is that happening? Is that just a function of ramping up production, or to what extent this trend can be supported?
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. The US production is, I think, almost 13.3 million, a record for the country. They've got a very specifically structured oil industry. It's hundreds, thousands of individual producers, all working very much under free market conditions. There's no state oil company interference. There's less governmental interference, and if we see maybe a Trump presidency looking ahead, I think it'll be the most fossil fuel government they could possibly hope for the next 4 years. Also US production's become very much more internationalized. The WTI Midland export grade, is now part of the North Sea benchmark, and keeping the North Sea benchmark relevant. And the exports, the US exports, 6-7 million barrels a day. So a big chunk of their domestic production is finding its way onto the international markets. So they've got the infrastructure, they've got very aggressive, very well managed major producers. And it's profitable at these current levels. $80 is perfectly profitable for most shale oil producers. So the US industry is in pretty good shape at the moment, as evidenced by the fact that oil production is over 13 million barrels a day. This current market is suiting them quite well.
Factor in this US market, what is the industry's attitude in oil production in the US with respect to the borrowings? Are they more cautious because the Federal Reserve, at the moment at least, will not decrease the interest rate? So are they cautious about borrowing?
I think the worries about borrowing, and I know we went through a stage when interest rates were very much on the increase to control inflation. I think that moment has almost certainly passed us. The US Federal Reserve has been quite clear in their signals. I think they'd like to see cuts earlier. I think the market had hoped at the beginning of the year that we would see the first cuts happen in the first quarter of this year, but we're possibly looking at May. For the first round of cuts. There are signals that they're looking to cut 1.5% in total in 2024. Very easy to say this at the moment, and anything could happen in between. But that's only going to make it easier for the sector. It's still a the optics, the public image of oil is never probably going to improve from where it is now. But borrowing will become cheaper. Remember, you've had high oil prices, which has enabled the industry to throw off a lot of cash. Now, a lot of that cash has been returned through dividends and via shareholders, but clearly from US production activity, a lot of it has gone into the ground and into production. So I think if you were looking at a most difficult point for the US sector, I think it's in the past. I think it's probably 6 to 12 months previous to us. So you could feasibly see more US production this year, if only you're probably going to be constrained somewhat by infrastructure and the availability of drilling and equipment and wells. But it's going to be probably a reasonably good year and a little bit more growth possible for the US sector this year.
Another factor that affects a lot oil price, of course, is geopolitics and rising geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, which accounts, according to International Energy Agency, for 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil trade. So what should we expect from these tensions, and could they lead also to further increases in oil prices?
Very possibly. I think there was a lot of the geopolitics is related to and centering around the Israel-Hamas war. Certainly the Houthi situation, the Iran-backed Houthi situation in the Red Sea is very closely linked to it and the ongoing tensions there. So many of these flashpoints that you do see in the Middle East, the real problems start if they become linked up and joined together and you get threats to infrastructure and production infrastructure. But at the moment, that's not really the case. What the geopolitical situation is, in my opinion, is it's one of the strongest bullish factors maintaining oil prices at the moment. We've got these global demand worries. They're providing headwinds for the price, but the geopolitics is keeping it much more, is providing support to oil prices. You're seeing real delays to shipping. You're seeing shipping having to be diverted around the coast of southern Africa. So that is adding real delays. It's adding real cost to a barrel of oil, and so that's supporting it. I had hoped myself that we might have seen a breakthrough just the weekend just gone, with some detente, with ceasefire discussions starting to be talked about with regards to Israel, but I don't think it's taken much tension out of the Houthi situation, with attacks back and forth between the US and the British and the Houthis themselves. So I think we've got a lot further to go with that situation, and hopefully it can be contained in the region, because it's very much a choke point, the Red Sea. And if you saw that spread to somewhere like the Straits of Hormuz in the Arab Gulf, then you'd have a much more escalated problem. So, it's going to be, it could get worse before it gets better.
Yes, you are right. Hopefully things going better. But the feeling in the market is that, well, there is a risk, and some vessels have started to avoid the waterway amid escalating regional tensions. So according to ship brokers and other market players, avoiding the Red Sea through the Suez Canal would disrupt flows of Middle East crude and Asian products to Europe. So how do these risks also affect the transport cost of oil right now?
Yeah, I mean, the transportation costs, I mean, a lot of companies straight away just said, well, we will avoid Maersk, I believe, or one of them, BP, I think, as well, just to let's avoid the Red Sea. It's not worth the risk at such an international choke point. Yes, it's added cost, but like so many things in this sector, the worry that where we would substitute Russian oil, the market does absorb this. You have to fill, I suppose, in the supply lines. So the initial problem was that vessels were simply taking longer to get to Europe, and product prices, there was upwards pressure on them because of availability. But those supply chain issues get filled in, and it's a constant stream. And that 10 to 12 days of extra travel around the south of Africa, it is being absorbed. And this has always been the case, that these particular impediments to global transportation get absorbed. So, and it's evident, I think, in the price of oil, which is, it's had a good day today, but it's slumped back below the $80 level. It seems to me that you need something big to get this oil price re-rated, if that's the current thinking.
You're right. Europe has had to diversify its overseas sources of both crude and products since its intention also to reduce oil purchases from Russia, now the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. So do you agree that Europe will have to import more oil from the US? And to what extent the EU can freely substitute these supplies in terms of different quality of oil from these traditional regions to US oil?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the US is one of the most obvious solutions for, and it has been a solution to increasing European barrels. US production is up about 1.8 million barrels in the last kind of around about 1.5 to 2 years, and much of this has gone into Europe because that's coincided with the cessation of Russian barrels. So, also aided by the fact that it's immediately purchasable. WTI Midland, that export grade that joined the BFOE benchmark only about 7 or 8 months ago, has really helped the pricing of US barrels into Europe. And obviously, they should get a little bit more production this year. You've also got other, we've looked at Brazil, Canada as well, Guyana. Those are the four primary sources of increased production in the OECD, and that's really helped. That's one of the things that's helped Europe, manage the Russian situation, and also manage the current situation that we're seeing with the Red Sea, which isn't really choking off major volumes. So, for another year, Europe has managed this, and eventually this will be absorbed into the fabric of the market, and it's remarkably fluid, the crude market, and it has absorbed this. You see those spikes in the price to $100 plus when there is the worry. A lot of this sentiment based, but the market tends to adjust and absorb these concerns.
Well, oil and gas also have high reserve replacement needs. And on the other hand, the demand is quite uncertain. Underinvestment threatens to undermine energy security in the short and medium term, and the fears expressed by some large resource holders and also certain oil companies that the world is underinvesting in oil supply. What is the investment trend in this uncertain demand outlook?
Well, it's where do you see, as a rhetorical question, where do you see peak demand? I mean, there is talk that peak demand could be 2030, which that is very short in oil industry terms, and that means that you'd have to look at any major project that you were planning to do now would be starting in 2030 possibly. So it's very much how you look and where you think demand's going to peak. I certainly think the oil majors are transitioning towards the energy transition. They're looking at that. We've done some study at ICIS, for example, reserve replacement, which a decade or two ago was a major metric of seeing how oil companies were replacing their production. It doesn't get a mention now. It literally doesn't get published. I assume because they're not 100% reserve replacement. I'm not sure that is the target anymore. It's certainly not an important target for a lot of modern day shareholders. And I think a very good example is, Saudi Arabia have put on hold their plans to extend their capacity to 13 million barrels a day. They've made a strategic decision to say, let's leave it at 12. That's a major signal. The market seemed to absorb that without much turmoil. But I do think that all the major players are starting to, call into question, do we want to be stuck with a major project producing hundreds of thousands of barrels a day when there's no demand for it in the mid-2030s? It's a huge strategic decision, and I think companies and state oil companies will go much more public with that kind of thinking and those kind of decisions over the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, after reviewing all these factors, I must ask you about the oil price, but I will not ask you what will be the exact oil price, because I know that among energy experts in the energy sector, when this question is addressed, energy experts are laughing and they are saying, okay, give me a moment, I will take my crystal ball. So I will not ask you this question like that. But well, with all these cocktail of factors, what will be the trend of oil price for midterm?
Well, there's always the prospect for spikes, and it's whether you believe that an increase represents a spike or whether you think it's a long-term trend. ICIS do internal analytics, and certainly for the next year or so. And, we've done some internal studies ourselves. We tend to look on shorter term parameters in the editorial department, maybe a week or a month, because as you say, the crystal ball is necessary for anything longer than that. But, this current level looks relatively stable, and stable is a very, very questionable way to ever describe the oil sector. But it looks like it'd be a real challenge to kind of test those long-term levels up towards $100 anymore. And current levels where we stand look like a market slightly in balance. Certainly, if you look at, it depends what you call medium term. But if you look at this year and forecasts beyond this year are very tenuous. But there is an element of stability. Daily volatility, it goes up one day, it goes down the next, is very much the pattern that we're seeing. But there is a certain balance in the market at the moment at this current levels where everyone seems to be able to get by. OPEC they're a bit short on their budgets, but it's profitable. It doesn't hurt the industrialized economies too much. I think the US is quite happy with it. It doesn't hurt their industry, and it doesn't hurt their gasoline prices. So I don't think you'll see too many surprises on the upside or the downside for a little while yet.
Well, hopefully the market will find this ideal price for consumers and for producers. Barney, thank you very much for sharing with us this ICIS outlook and also your knowledge. It's very much appreciated.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bueno, el experto de ICIS, Barney Gray, ha compartido con nosotros este escenario y vemos que la demanda de petróleo no desaparecerá en el futuro previsible, pero la industria del petróleo está bajo presión con los temas medioambientales e incertidumbre ante la demanda. El petróleo sigue desempeñando un papel relevante en las cadenas de suministro de muchos productos. Cuando decimos que queremos descarbonizar, hay que pensar no solo en el transporte, sino en todos estos sectores. Todo esto tiene impacto en los planes de inversión y proyectos de producción. Continuaremos al tanto de estos temas y tendencias energéticas. Mientras tanto, os deseo muy buena energía y hasta pronto.